Good afternoon. I'm Ido Berger, faculty co-director of the science program at the Harvard Radcliffe Institute and professor of astronomy in the Harvard Faculty of Arts and Sciences. It is my pleasure to welcome you back to the second session of our symposium, The Course of Women's Lives. The session will be moderated by Dr. Jill Goldstein, founder and executive director of the Innovation Center on Sex Differences in Medicine at Mass General Hospital, the Helen T. Morshner Endowed MGH Research Institute Chair in Women's Health, and professor of psychiatry and professor of medicine at the Harvard Medical School. Dr. Goldstein will introduce our distinguished panelists. Dr. Goldstein, the stage is yours.
First of all, thank you so much for having me. This is going to be a hard act to follow, but I think you're going to enjoy our amazing, amazing panelists. I'm just going to introduce all three first. Just really briefly, they are amazing panelists, and if I gave you their full, even brief bio, we would be here for a half hour, just for that. So, Dr. Linda Griffith is the School of Engineering Teaching Innovation Professor of Biological and Mechanical Engineering and a McVicar Fellow at MIT, where she directs the Center for Gynepathology Research. Her current research integrates systems biology and immunology to humanize drug development with a focus on chronic inflammatory diseases, which we'll hear about today. And Dr. Griffith is a member of the National Academy of Engineering, a MacArthur Fellow, and a former Radcliffe Fellow, which is wonderful. Colin Hill is the co-founder and chief executive officer of ITEA and a leading voice in AI and precision medicine, which we heard about in the last panel. He has extensive experience developing and commercializing AI solutions in drug discovery, drug development, and managed care. At ITEA, he leads efforts to harness causal AI, multi-omics data, and digital twins, which I think he was going to tell us about today, to accelerate discovery of new therapeutics in partnership with biopharma companies. And I was interested to see that you began in physics, which is really quite interesting how you ended up where you ended up. And then Dr. Deborah Cato is a professor of medicine at Stanford, where she serves as a chief of research for the geriatric session, co-directs the Stanford Longevity Center, which we'll hear about this afternoon, and directs the Geriatric Research, Education, and Clinical Center at the VA Palo Alto Healthcare System. She's a specialist in bone health, which we know a lot of sex differences in bone health, and conducted extensive research on osteoporosis, the gut microbiome, and the effects of cancer treatment on aging. So it's an amazing panel. I feel very honored to moderate this panel, and I think we'll just jump right into it, right? Okay. Now, our topic today, I mean, when I first heard this topic, the course of women's lives. I mean, come on. Seriously, Immaculata and Becky. We're moderating a panel on all of that? Okay, all right. But as you can hear from these, amazing panelists, what we're really going to focus on today is just a piece of this which has to do, not a small piece, of not only our health, but disease risk, and think about it in that context of medicine. A couple of little housekeeping things first about language. We're just going to use what typically is used when we say sex and gender. So sex is biologic aspects like sex chromosomes and gonadal hormones that are related to being a male or female, and gender will be used in terms of social roles, expectations, behavior. Okay. Now, sex and gender differences in diseases and in disease risk are pervasive across the lifespan. Understanding these differences are not only critical for attenuating disability and ultimately preventing disease, but they also really tell us something about health and maintaining health across our lifespan. And they also provide really important insights into the development of diagnostic tools and therapies and identifying high-risk populations to target early for prevention. Now, this panel will provide insights into how we might think about women's health and disease across the lifespan in order to provide clues as to who to target and how, and to innovate ways to follow women across the lifespan. Now, there are naturalistic windows of opportunity when sex differences in diseases occur, and that is when the brain and the body are either differentially flooded with gonadal hormones or depleted of gonadal hormones in fetal development, in puberty, pregnancy, and in menopause. And we can use these naturalistic windows of opportunity to tell us not only about how, health, how we can retain being healthy, but also how we can target earlier for prevention high-risk populations, because we know that is when sex differences in diseases emerge. Now, Deborah, as an expert in aging, can you tell us how you think about the fact that a baby girl born today can potentially expect to live a century? How can women think about healthy aging and longevity? And how has the field of geriatrics thought about this?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to be on this panel today. And I just would like to state, just think about that for a moment. Isn't it amazing that a baby girl today can anticipate a century-long life? Pretty amazing, especially since just a century ago, the average life expectancy was just under 60. So we've made great gains because of sanitation, antibiotics, vaccines, et cetera. But we have challenges, right? So currently in the United States, the average life expectancy for a woman is about 81 years old, and for a man, maybe about 76, plus or minus, meaning, and what we see here is women do tend to live longer than men, and this has been shown globally with an average lifespan discrepancy of about 5 to 7 years. So that sounds pretty good for women. We get to live longer. But on the other hand, you may have heard that people commonly believe that women spend more years in poor health than men. And in fact, in a JAMA article published from the WHO data of about 183 countries, suggests that over the past 2 decades, the lifespan, health span discrepancy has increased the most in the United States at about 12.4 years, so that we would maybe reach an average age of 63 to 65 and expect to live another 12 to 15 years in poor health. And the WHO also realizes that people think, okay, that's great that we're living longer, but what really matters to me is to be healthy, right? So how can we live our lives healthily? So as a geriatrician, and a geriatrician is a physician who is specially trained to take care of older adults, I don't really like the term health span. And the reason for this is because as a physician, I feel that health span can mean different things to different people. So it's too general. So I've been going around the United States, or whoever will listen to me, medical students, undergrads, that we should really be thinking about healthy longevity. Now, what is the difference between healthy longevity and health span? Well, I think my geriatrician colleagues agree that healthy longevity really describes a heterogeneous state. So whether you're a geriatrician, clinician who sees patients, or a gerontologist who studies aging, which I also do, we know that if you're lucky enough to get over the age of 65 and live a nice long life, that people just become more heterogeneous. They don't become more dissimilar than alike. So from a study perspective, this could be just vital signs, temperature, heart rate, fasting blood sugar. It can be the differences in our gut microbiome composition. It can be DNA methylation clocks, a measure of physiologic aging. They just get more spread out instead of more alike. And the beauty about healthy longevity is it really can vary over time, right? And geriatricians know that, well, health span is kind of defined as being disability-free. Well, healthy longevity does not require that. So anybody can theoretically appreciate a life that is a healthy longevity. So that's the main thing.
Okay. And Linda, as an expert in the onset and course prognosis of endometriosis, let's use that as an example then to think about reproductive health over the lifespan. We know that it can emerge in puberty or it can emerge at the other end in postmenopause. So how can we think about that from this lifespan perspective in order to target it early? And what kinds of tools are you building to address these needs?
So first let's talk about what endometriosis is so everybody's on the same page. And I'd like to include its sister sibling disease, adenomyosis, which is strongly related. Endometriosis refers to the growth outside the uterus of tissue that resembles the endometrium, which is the epithelial lining of the uterus with its associated stroma, blood vessels, and immune cells. And there's a lot of emphasis on endometrial-like because getting to the point of across the health, first of all, you find this tissue growing on the abdominal wall, little lesions, maybe a millimeter in diameter. You do pathology and it looks very much like the endometrium. But you can also find it invading the bowel. When I visited my collaborator in Brazil, he excised 10 centimeters of a patient's bowel because she had 2 huge lesions that were causing her to be unable to poop. So it can invade the bowel, it can invade the bladder, it can invade, many tissues tend to be stiff tissues, different tropism than ovarian cancer. It can even go through the diaphragm and get to the lungs. So and adenomyosis is when this kind of lesion appears in the muscle of the uterus itself in the myometrium. Very, very underappreciated and understudied. The symptoms of endometriosis often start right around the time of menarche and include enormous discomfort during menstruation, including dysmenorrhea, menstrual pain, constipation, diarrhea, many, many kinds of symptoms, vomiting, fatigue, and so on, and they can progress through a number of stages as the patient gets older. The point about lifespan starts because we still don't understand the etiology of this disease. It can, and there's debate about whether it just comes from refluxed menstrual tissue. Your uterus contracts all the time, and during menses, stuff's supposed to go out through the cervix, but it can go out the fallopian tubes into the peritoneal cavity. This happens in most women, but in some women, it's believed that this tissue can live and attach and grow, and often on the ovaries especially. But there's also a lot of indications that it may be more developmental in nature and actually happen postnatally or very soon neonatally or at some point later before the girl starts menarche because there's often terrible GI symptoms. And so we don't know the etiology, so we don't actually know when this disease starts. What we do know is there's an incredible diagnosis bias toward thinking that patients are in their late 20s or 30s and that they're patients who are infertility patients. So we have a lot to do on this. There's across the lifespan many associations with cardiovascular disease and other diseases if you have endometriosis. So it's a great example of a disease that brings in many, many different organ systems and affects them with chronic inflammation. When we started working in this disease 15 years ago, I started a center at MIT. We focused on trying to bring systems biology into the disease to study the patient differences, their molecular differences, and then to build models of these patients, living patient avatars, and I can show you this at the reception. We actually build now, we have a paper that just is going up online today, where we can build little models of endometriosis lesions using biopsies from the patient's lesions or her eutopic tissue, make organoids and get the associated cells and make little blood vessels. And this lets us use air and vacuum with microfluidic pumps to pump culture media through little tiny blood vessels and watch immune trafficking. It's really extremely important to think of these approaches because the animal models do not reflect the human condition. Animals don't manage their hormones the same way. They don't even make sex hormone binding globulin, most of the animal models used, et cetera. So our whole team at MIT, which now includes about a dozen faculty across MIT developing imaging and other technologies, is helping us build these alternatives to animals so that we can study not just endometriosis, but a whole spectrum of diseases that skew female and are very difficult to study because female immunology is very different than male, and we need to control the hormones and everything else in a very, very precise way. So we were just successful in raising a $10 million gift to start something we're calling Moonshot for Menstruation Science that lets us build these so-called novel alternative methods and share them with people around the world. And I look forward to talking with you more about these approaches because they'll be widely useful in many areas of biomedical research, and NIH is now pushing us to have more of these to replace animals.
Okay, I think we're going to get all three on the table, and then we can mix and match, because I'm going to ask Colin now, from an AI point of view, how has your company been using it to address women's health needs? And I'd love to hear, first to maybe educate the audience about what do you mean when you say AI, since it's used in so many different contexts.
Thank you. That's a great place to start. I certainly do not mean ChatGPT and large language models or self-driving cars. Those are nice. But AI in the space of biomedical research has had a long trajectory. I guess first off, we are really onto the third wave of AI, period, right? I don't think a lot of people know this. AI first started in the 1940s, and it was called various things, and we went through a second revolution of AI called expert systems in the 80s. People put that on the shelf, didn't work well enough, and it was really with the rise of data, cheap, fast data, and very large-scale computing that gave rise to the ability to now develop AI tools. Now, AI in the biomedical world is very different than AI in the consumer internet world. First, because of data. So in the world of the consumer internet, you have a large corpus of data that's out there and for free that keeps on getting generated in the form of human text and imagery. In the world of biomedical research, we are very dependent on patient-level data. And that has been the big holdback of our industry, the overall biotech and pharmaceutical industry and biomedical research for decades and decades. That is finally changing. We are now 24 years past the sequencing of the human genome, and yet we still do not have new therapeutics that have emerged from this great new data set or the computing power. And so I would say that in 2025, we're now on the precipice of a real change across a number of diseases, especially those diseases that particularly affect women, because we now have the chance to start to reverse engineer the actual complex system of interacting genes and proteins that drive clinical outcomes. We call these computer models digital twins because they are now a chance to replicate human disease gene by gene, protein by protein, and start to fill in all the missing pieces. If I was to just put a question to the audience of what percentage of the circuitry, the blueprint of human disease do you think we know today after close to a century of biomedical research, tens of thousands of papers published every year? And when I say circuitry, I mean equivalent to the blueprint you have of a computer chip that now get up to numbers of tens of billions of pieces and interconnects. So just a wild guess from the audience. What percentage of this blueprint do we know? 1%? I heard 40 somewhere. 20. Okay, great. So a lot of variation of opinion. That's great. The estimates that we've seen are on the order of 5%, and I believe there was a 5% somewhere. So that means that 95% of the circuitry of human disease is hidden. We just simply don't know how the genes and proteins interconnect to drive clinical outcomes, whether that's in breast cancer or endometriosis or in any number of diseases. So the question is, how do we start to fill in those missing pieces? Because otherwise, our ability to discover and develop new and effective drugs and do that in a cost-effective way and in a timely way is going to be stymied for years and decades to come. And so there's now the ability to integrate not just genomic data, but now data across many different molecular levels tied to clinical outcomes. And with very powerful computing, together with advances in AI, a very different kind of AI, causal AI, and I think we heard the prior speaker mention it, we now have the ability to start to reconstruct the systems that control our disease. And so what AI means for women's health really falls into three categories. One is innovation, the discovery and development of drugs that would otherwise never be discovered or would take many decades and even centuries to be figured out. That's number one. I think the second is personalization. How do you now better match drugs to the individual patient? Because all people, all women are different in very fundamental ways that can now be measured. The third and final is access. If we're not just talking about this rarefied area of Cambridge or Greater Boston, and we're talking about how do we get care across the country to many women in many different situations, and not just in the United States, then we need to have solutions that can scale, that can do radiology interpretation for not very much money, because nurses and doctors will never fill in that gap, especially in the developing world. And so AI is going to be critical in really closing that gap, both in this country and beyond.
Mm-hmm. Okay, everybody was so perfect in their 5 minutes, which is, I don't think that's ever happened in a science academic thing. Okay. So I'm going to ask the two of you to address the following, because Linda is describing for us a chip in which she is trying to model as many of the components of a living person that she can on this chip. And Colin, you are describing, of course, big data is dependent on the data that you have.
Yes. Yes.
So how are you going to address that in terms of getting as close to reality, let's put it that way, as possible in terms of health and disease over the course of women's lives, which is, obviously quite a large spectrum of trying to collect data over these courses. So why don't you start?
I love the question for a number of reasons. So at our company, we are religious about starting with patient tissue versus cell lines, versus animal models, versus stem cells. And the reason is because we want to get as close to the real thing as possible. And it's even better if the data is longitudinal, so you can see how the disease is evolving over time. I would say that preclinical systems have more or less failed the biotech and pharmaceutical industry. That's a controversial statement, but I think it's true. There's actually something I agree with the current FDA about, which is the fact that they are really pushing to reduce the use of animal models in biomedical research and drug discovery and development for a very good reason, that still 8 to 9 out of 10 drugs fail in clinical development. And just for everyone who's not living and breathing the pharma industry every day, these are the drug candidates that are supposed to be the best candidates after years and years of testing in preclinical systems, tens of millions of dollars to nominate the best drug to put into human testing, and 8 or 9 out of 10 times it fails. And so therefore, we are clearly optimizing to the wrong endpoint. I believe we now have a chance. I think we are at a very important inflection point in our industry where we can start to reconstruct more and more accurate replicas of human disease straight from the tissue of interest, or at least a nearby tissue like blood or spinal fluid. And this will be, in my opinion, I think the greatest transformation of biomedical research and drug discovery and development we will see in our lifetimes, because I just don't believe that preclinical systems, some are better than others. I think Linda's is great, by the way. But I do think the more we can start with human and to get to human discoveries, the better.
So I'd like to add to that, and I'll use an illustrative example. As Colin has so underscored, we don't necessarily have the right kind of data. And in a disease like endometriosis, there's certainly enormous genetic GWAS studies, family linkage studies, and so on that are giving us hints at things that may be involved. So, for example, there are reports of variants in interleukin-1 alpha that have been reported, and this is of tremendous interest. They're what are called non-synonymous variants, so they actually have a change in amino acids. No one really knows what it's doing to the protein level function in the tissue, and this is where we come in. The genetics is not going to necessarily help you get to that patient's differences, but we can look at those patients' lesions with various spatial proteomics and transcriptomics. We can actually get lesions from those patients and start to look at how is their immune system different than in patients in the lesion from those who don't have that variant, and then we can try to build them in the lab in our chips and get at questions of how we might see functional differences in a complex tissue setting from these variants in this very, very important immune mediator, which is known to be involved generally in endometriosis, but this specific variant, it may be that it's not transcribed as well, or that it doesn't interact with the receptor as well, or various things that in the tissue context. So I think we need both the AI and big data kinds of approaches because they guide what we're going to do and look at here, because these are very expensive experiments to do. Very high information content, but very expensive. So this is where we sort of merge, and NIH calls these novel alternative methods. And industry is really going for this. We have a very, very large project with Novo Nordisk. They built a lab out in Watertown just to interact with my whole team, the systems biology and the in vitro models, and that's around cardiometabolic disease. But it's still the same idea that we've got to have patient data. You can't get certain kinds of longitudinal data, dynamic data in patients. You can get it in something like this because you can look at it with microscopes and you can give it drugs and you can do all kind of stuff to it.
So let's get Deborah involved in this for a moment. And I think I'm going to ask you to speak to the fact that traditionally women's health has been thought of as reproductive health, which we've been focusing on at the moment. But probably the bulk of sex difference in disease or sex-specific diseases is really about not necessarily specific, but dependent in a way, so that differences between men and women in chronic disease and the incidence and prevalence of everything from cardiovascular disease, diabetes, certainly all of the brain disorders that I study in terms of depression, in terms of anxiety disorders, and of course, in terms of all the autoimmune disorders that you are an expert in osteoporosis, for example. So maybe you can address for us some of these questions about how, with some of the tools that you use in terms of your longevity center and so on, to think about identifying over the course of women's lives, how do you identify these high-risk people to target early that could perhaps provide information for AI rather than just throw everything into the gamish? You can think about how to ask very targeted questions of AI and combine some of these. And by the way, I believe in animal models still, but that's another topic. Okay.
We'll talk.
I do too.
I'm ready
I
to.
still believe in them. We have a movement called Move Over Mice, not put them in the wood chipper today.
Okay. Those basic scientists out there, I have your back, I promise. Talk to me later. Okay.
Yeah, so to weigh in on that conversation for a second, I also, I am an animal lover for sure, but I can give you an example from basic mouse knockout to the, within 10 years, bringing a drug called denosumab, which helps to treat osteoporosis to market. So there are successful models, and I don't really like to study mice, and we had dogs. That's how we got insulin. I mean, these are not pretty times, but they have advanced our knowledge of medicine. So I thank all of those mice and dogs. It's actually a great question. I'm thinking back to the part where I was saying that people tend to believe that women live more of their lives kind of with chronic disease or in poor health. And I would say that there is a debate upon that, but for the people who have studied this across the world, what they're looking at is kind of how people function. So in geriatrics, we have measures of activities of daily living, which are just basic things. Can you take care of yourself, go to the bathroom, get dressed, bathe yourself, feed yourself, etc. And then we have something called instrumental activities of daily living, which are kind of the things you need to go to college. So, can you prepare your meals? Can you do your laundry, etc.? Can you get places? And when you look at those metrics, women on average do worse than men. So, and those are things that are important, right? Because if you talk to a person as they age, one of the things that seems most common, not always, but most common, is that people value their independence, particularly in America. And in order to do that, you really need to maintain your mobility, right, to be able to get places. And what studies after studies show that adult men tend to be stronger, they tend to be faster, they tend to have better bone density, stronger bones, than women. And with aging, and particularly with women as they go through menopause, all of those things go down. So our strength goes down, our ability to walk faster goes down, and our bone density goes down. And when they go or get below a certain threshold, that's when disease risk really increases. Although there are a lot of people in the longevity space, and there's a thing called biohacking where people are really trying to reverse aging or even live forever, there is an abundance of science that has been around for decades that demonstrates repeatedly, even in mice, but really in humans, because that's what we care about, that if you remain physically active, you use your body in space, you work on balance, you walk more than whatever 1,000 steps a day, that you are going to be more likely to live a longer and healthier life. So, and I say this cannot begin too early, that thanks to women or girls getting into sports, we have many more female athletes now. We have the WNBA, all of these things, everything in moderation though, from a geriatric standpoint, because if you do get injured, then you, especially as you get older, it just takes longer to recover. But the bottom line is that you can recover. And I love to tell my medical students about a study that came out actually of Spalding Rehab, where it was published around 1990, where they enrolled about 10, not a lot, but 10 people who lived in a nursing home and essentially high-intensity interval training. And nowadays, most people know what that means, but in case not, it's like this cardiometabolic plus, resistance training type of exercise. And they showed that over 8 weeks, 3 times a week for an hour, these guys built muscle. They started walking faster. They can get up the stairs. And that was just in a short 8-week period. I think their mean age was 93. So what I also like to say is that it's not too late but you have to work at it. So that use it or lose it adage remains true to this day.
I'm going to mix these with questions that are coming in. I just want to remind people, I have a little Slido tablet here, and I am going to be reading some of these, mixing it up. So please do send your questions in. And I think following that, we're going to ask both, really any one of you, but I suppose this one was directed to Deborah and Linda about taking this life course approach, or though really from an AI point of view, what do you wish your patients had known about 10 years ago, 30 years ago, and 50 years ago? 50 years ago would be, I don't know, were you seeing patients? I doubt it.
Okay.
I think I'm the only older person on the stage right now. So.
Seen patients for 35 years. Does that count?
So, yes. So since taking the life course approach, what do you wish? I mean, you were talking about what women need to know.
Yeah.
What would you have wished your patients did know that we know now? And how can we take action?
I think that as a younger physician, I changed over the years of I treated patients through the HIV epidemic and lost a lot of people in underserved populations. But I think what I wish that I could impart on every patient is that everybody does have agency. So no matter where you come from, what your condition is, that there is hope. And I don't know if I did that, I can't really remember, but that's certainly something that I do now, because you can live the perfect lifestyle and think you're just doing so great that you look at whatever metric on your watch that I'm in the 95th percentile of X. But things happen, and it's not necessarily someone's fault, but I find that that's what happens, particularly with cancer diagnoses, that patients tend to think, what did I do to get this? And I think I would like my patients before not to blame themselves or anybody else necessarily. And hopefully we have the tools to really ensure, and cancer is becoming a chronic disease thanks to a lot of the developments that have happened over the past 15 years.
I'd like to briefly underscore agency and advocacy for yourself, and especially in the case of gynecology diseases that have onset in teenage years, where teenagers are often not taken seriously. I got involved in endometriosis research because my niece, who grew up in Atlanta, she's 30 years younger than me, she started having the exact same symptoms I had when I was 12. She was missing school, she got put on birth control pills, it didn't work, she had GI symptoms, she had sent all of these GI tests that came back with not showing anything, including a colonoscopy. And her female OBGYN, even after I told the OBGYN, this is exactly my experience, argued with me and said, you haven't seen this patient. And she told my sister that my niece was making everything up to get out of going to school. Okay, my niece was 15. I got her referred to a really good surgeon in Atlanta, and she had stage 3 endometriosis when she was 16. She had it on her appendix and so on. And so I think going back, this was 15 years ago, advocacy for agency and advocacy are things that you really, really want to have for patients. You know your body. The most important thing, you know your body. And I learned to say that to doctors, and I've had a lot of things happen, but having young women be able to understand they know their body and they need to be taken seriously, and they should never not take no for an answer if something's really wrong. They should keep going until they find an answer is one of the things. And then, of course, pelvic floor therapy. Oh, God, for endometriosis, it's been a game. Pelvic floor therapy. It's so many new things. Nutrition, exercise, so many more lifestyle things are coming out that seriously will make life better. Pelvic floor therapy and nutrition. Lots of, for patients who can tolerate fiber. And I could go on and on about that, but I won't. But there's a lot coming down the pipe.
Yeah, and also, what's interesting is sort of shared experiences across the lifespan, because that is part of the menopause issues that are being raised right now with the new incredible sort of public demand and physicians' demand really to understand more about menopause and deal with those symptoms as well. Colin, I'm going to bring you in on this, okay? Can you talk about how AI can close the gaps in life course longitudinal research that really begins in fetal development and birth until you're older, and really understanding some of the early risk factors to try to target them early for prevention? How can AI be part of that story?
So I'm really happy that our system is starting to transition to becoming much more data-driven than it was even 10, 20, 30 years ago. And there's a number of things driving that. The tools have gotten a lot better, whether it's proteomics or genomics or even imaging, and they've gotten a lot cheaper, and access is growing in a big way. Now, data by itself isn't that useful, and data on one patient isn't that useful in one data point, but when you start to have data across big populations of thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of women at many different time points and many different layers of data, that's where you need truly AI to make sense of it. Like mathematics and data analytics has been around for forever, and I think too oftentimes people will label something AI just because it's cool now, but it's really when the data points get to be that large and you're dealing with systems that are that complex that AI really has a chance to, in a much more precise way and even a mechanistic way with causal AI approaches, start discovering the factors early that are driving disease outcomes much further down the road. Take Alzheimer's, for example. Where we're starting to see some real progress is coming from the fact that there's a chance for data to be collected 10, 15, even 20 years earlier than amyloid plaques show up and any signs and symptoms of dementia. And it's that kind of longitudinal data collection, once again, not over dozens of people, but this is where you need large populations that allow you to start to tease apart those factors. And oftentimes, it's not just a single factor. If it was a single factor, a lot of these key discoveries would have been made a long time ago. But the truth is, and it's one of the reasons why GWAS, which is genome-wide association studies, probably weren't that useful. It's because oftentimes most diseases are complex. You have multiple factors driving the outcome, and you have that across a heterogeneous population. And so this is where AI, I believe, is starting to make big advances, especially when you have not just one type of molecular data form like DNA sequencing, but you have that combined with gene expression, with epigenomics, with proteomics, and along with clinical outcomes, and especially if it's across diverse populations. So I'm super bullish on what's coming in the next few years.
There are a few questions here about tracking, continuous hormonal tracking, things like that are both related, obviously, to the impact of changes in menstrual cycle, but also thinking about, you mentioned the risk for Alzheimer's disease, which really gets revealed. Those of you who don't know, women have a much higher frequency of Alzheimer's disease, and we know now it is not only because women live longer, and as Colin mentioned, 15 to 20 years prior to the onset of symptoms is when the disease begins. So if we could think about targeting those areas with some kind of hormonal tracking, is industry thinking about that? Are you working with academia to one of my favorite questions is how do we get academics and industry to actually talk with each other and to develop new tools and therapeutics that incorporate the impact of sex? So can you address that for us?
Sure. So our company certainly does work with a lot of academics who are, they're doing things, they're putting together data sets, typically consortiums, even public-private partnerships, that are creating data sets that no single company could do. You take the UK Biobank or FinGen or the All of Us effort in the United States, and this is proliferating both here.
Can you describe what those are to the audience? Because
Oh,
they probably don't know that.
So these are large-scale public-private initiatives to do DNA sequencing across hundreds of thousands of patients, now also collecting gene expression data, which is measuring the levels of activity of all the genes at the same time, doing the same on the proteomics level, and then tracking what diseases develop over time in those patients. There's other similar studies that are disease-specific from the beginning, like in Alzheimer's, the ADNI study, and a number of other efforts that are now trying to collect large enough data sets to now discover really the key drivers of these diseases. And while we have not started working with any groups that are tracking hormones longitudinally, we are super excited to add that layer of data. These hormones are clearly a master driver, a master regulator of much of what happens to the rest of our systems. And so as one can collect the correct samples, we would love to collaborate with various groups.
There's a great question here. Please keep your questions coming. But there's a great question. I'm going to ask Deborah to start with this. How can we garner early education? I love that question because, of course, being someone who really tries to look at the early antecedents of the risk for diseases across the lifespan, beginning in fetal development, like early education, even pregnant mothers, is really important. So Deborah, from your kind of longitudinal and health perspective, have you thought about how we might use maybe some of the tools that Colin has to think about targeting earlier groups, earlier education?
Well, I think that, for instance, probably amongst this group, I could just say, we should start in the home, and here are some tools that you can get to ensure that your child develops in the best ways possible to get them to be college-bound, et cetera. But what I think my message would be, no matter where you are, but you're a parent or an aunt or an uncle, and you have access to young children, that it would be about listening to them and also hopefully educating them in that realm in terms of taking care of themselves, better dietary choices, the ability that as a kid you should actually be able to play and learn from your playing, getting physical activity skills and whatever that might be across a whole landscape, because we're not all the same. We don't all come from the same background, and we don't have the same access. So I think if we could empower parents and people who take care of young children to be able to give them the tools to say, what you put in your mouth is almost like medicine. It matters. You can make your healthy choices. And also to not sit in front of a TV all day or play video games, that we would do a lot better as a society on a whole. And that doesn't have to be a big, expensive thing. That could just be, just getting the word out, kind of like what we saw happened in Alabama.
Linda, early education.
So I think Deborah made a lot of really great points. I was struck by a colleague who's a VC whose daughter had a really difficult situation when she was 10, 11, 12. And she said, I was looking for books on menstruation to share with my daughter, and there's really nothing there. We should write a book together. And I have so much time to write a book for, 10-year-olds. But I think there's a whole compendium of things. We certainly have multiple points of interaction with children, and I think I love the examples, having grown up in rural South Georgia. I love those examples, but one of the places, my dad was a Rotary Club president, so I really love that story. But I think also through churches, there's, if we think, I go to a church where there is a very international community, a lot of West African immigrants from parts of Nigeria where their Christians are being slaughtered and so on. So there's just a different way, and people want to engage around science. I think engaging around science in general with the public is one facet of that overall, because there's, as we heard so beautifully in the last panel, a mistrust in science. How do we just start to engage in a daily basis with the children in our lives and young people is one part of it.
And Colin, how can we bring in the discourse about differences between men and women, males and females, however you would like to define, but how can we bring that discourse into the kinds of development of tools that you are beautifully bringing to patients?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it often comes up in the context of social equity and things like that. But I look at that question really from a standpoint of doing good science. These models learn from diversity. They learn from differences of all kinds, and gender differences or sex differences are fundamental. And so I think as these larger biobank efforts are kicking off and some of them are maturing, I think there's going to be more and more results that are sex specific that start to emerge and start to tell us some very deep things. We were part of this global neurodegeneration proteomics consortium that was launched by Gates Ventures. That's the Bill Gates and Johnson & Johnson. And the early results that have started coming out around Alzheimer's have shown huge gender differences in some of the early markers that have been predictive of Alzheimer's. So I think as we start to actually see real results that come out that are specific between men and women, I think it's going to become part and parcel of how studies get designed.
I hope you're right. Excuse me. I hope you're right, since we've been trying to do this for many years, and we're those of us in the field, it has not been a priority. Let's put it that way. I'm just going to follow up on a couple of questions here as we're discussing this. We're talking about early education of the public. What about our young scientists? What kinds of ways are you targeting young scientists over at Stanford?
Oh, okay. I was going to actually follow up on the education piece because
please do. We have time.
It's actually hard to educate if you don't know. And so Jill and I were talking about this before this session about my role as co-director of the Stanford Longevity Center. Well, it's been around since about 2007, but in 2018, Dr. Laura Carstensen, who's a psychologist and the founder of the center, really thought about the century-long life, I guess, advantage or whatever conundrum. I don't know, it depends on how you look at it. And so she and colleagues developed this idea that we really need a new map. We need a new map of life because, for example, back when Perkins in 1936 or so developed Social Security, that made a ton of sense, and it could be financially viable. But truly, in 2034, we are going to have more people over the age of 65 than under the age of 18. That's the way the demographic is going. So from a financial perspective, we really should be prepared and thinking about how are we going to survive as a society and make sure that people can live healthy lives. Also, this education paradigm. So the educational paradigm is that I guess you go to preschool, and then you go to kindergarten, and then you go to grade school, and then you graduate high school, and maybe or maybe not, you get secondary education. But that's all kind of done by the age of 22. But if you get into Stanford and you're going to graduate school and you're thinking about a career in science, maybe you'd be about 26 or 30 or something like that. So I'm going to get to that, but you'll have to remind me if I forget. So the idea is that education, why should it just stop in the first third of life? This should be something that we're thinking about all along the life the lifespan, that we should constantly be learning. And in fact, when you're talking about prevention of something like as scary as Alzheimer's disease, that actually using your noodle and learning new things, working on music or dance or whatever, just something that you have not done before. I'm not a green thumb, for example. Maybe I should take up gardening. It would be challenging for me. But those kinds of things are really what we should be thinking about in terms of education. So even if someone didn't even finish high school or has a graduate education degree, there's so many resources now from the internet where you can learn, and I think we need to think about that. From a clinician scientist standpoint, we're really in an era of challenge, right? The old model of NIH federal funding to get what we call a training award or a K award if you're a physician that buys out 75% of your time so that you can learn how to do research correctly, and then 25% clinical. That's still around, but given all the kind of disruptions that are happening, whether that's going to continue to be the model is completely unclear. So it's a little scary because change is scary, but on the other hand, there may be some unforeseen benefits about how this can happen. So for my students who are current med students or PhDs or postdocs even, and they're looking at the lay of the land and it's looking pretty uncertain, like how am I going to pay off my loans, or how am I going to feed my family, how am I going to have a regular life, I really go back to what Dr. Ursula said, is like, what brings you passion? What excites you? And if you're passionate about it, just go for it. Right now, NIH, even though the government is shut down, I just submitted a grant, okay? The portal is open. I hear and so you keep on going, and then you get inventive. So I said, actually, you gotta look at industry. You know, the academics have been traditionally not great at translating their science into therapies. So this could be the opportune time, because we have enough money around there to do this, and we need to help them think creatively and how they can fund their science. But also, I really am a stickler on how is this going to make a difference.
And can you address it from the women's health perspective, Linda? Can we bring it back to that?
I want to tie on to the translation into industry, because when I started my Center for Gynepathology Research in 2009, I knew nothing about endometriosis. It was a jump into the deep end, and I had a lot of tutors and a really welcoming community. The surgeons welcomed me. But we had our eye on really trying to get non-hormonal drugs into the clinic, because hormonal-based drugs, there's a lot of dogma, I'll just say, and inflammation is really the hallmark. And I can say right now I'm working with two potential drug candidate, I'm doing preclinical modeling of two potential drug candidates, and one is with a large pharma company. And I can't say who it is, but it is, for me, a huge milestone. In 2 weeks, I'll go to a big meeting where they're going to plan a clinical trial for this drug, and I can hardly believe it, because for 6 years I lobbied this company to even think about endometriosis. I had to go over and over and over again to various kinds of activities, give seminars, write grants, and I've done this at so many big pharma companies. They're very interested, but what will happen is you get the few scientists internally who become your champions, and if they will fight for you, and if they will fight for the disease, and often they will if they have someone affected, you can ultimately get to the upper management. But you have to stick with it. You have to keep going. I once flew out to San Francisco a week after I had breast cancer surgery, because I could not cancel that trip because the whole project was on it. So the education is also to industry. You can educate them. Here's how you can do the clinical trial. Here's how you think about your inclusion criteria. Here's how you can validate your target, et cetera, et cetera. So I think education is across the spectrum. And I'll say that there was an article about my work in the New York Times a few years ago, and I've heard from scientists all over the world that influenced them to think about studying endometriosis, and some of them have made strong contributions even since then. So I think education is multifactorial. There's no scenario where you can't talk to someone, and you just never know how it may send something off in their head to help this process.
Colin, do you have a comment? Do you want to add anything?
I'm a big fan of the work of both of these researchers, and I've followed Linda's career forever, so that's fantastic that you got that drug moving. So
There's another one too, a startup drug, June kinase inhibitor. Got to talk to you about it.
I'm going to switch gears here because there's a few questions about this. It's also, one in which I'm quite interested in working on, which has to do with hormone therapy and longevity. And we know, depending on when you're targeting it, it's actually good for the brain. And so how do you think about that? The benefits, the risks in terms of longevity. I'm looking at the physician right now to start the conversation, and whether you've had a lot of questions recently about this.
Well, I'm not a menopausal, a physician who specializes in menopause, but I do think that the question has rightfully been reopened since the results of the Women's Health Initiative that suggested that particularly for women over the age of 65, hormone therapy, in the case this was Premarin or estrogen and Provera, progesterone combined in a pill, was not shown to have a benefit and actually harm. So there was a big dial back in anybody taking any hormones whatsoever. And this is where I'm thinking about the advent of precision health, because I don't think we have all the answers now, but I think clearly there is a space for why estrogen is good for us, and there is a window. Just from my own research, for example, I studied what the causes and consequences of postural changes with aging, and had the access to 10,000 women who had reported taking hormone replacement therapy, because this was the 80s and 90s, and certainly those who had reported taking it or current users had better posture 16 years later. So that's just another example of where, on average, it seemed to help with something in terms of the posture, but there are also risks, blood clots, heart attacks. So I don't have the answer, but if they're symptomatic, I think most people, and by symptomatic I mean hot flashes, just can't think straight, I'm in a brain fog, and you've just had menopause, it makes sense to treat the symptoms. But how long and et cetera, I don't have the answers for that.
Well, because there were 3 or 4 questions around this, I'm just going to say there is a lot of current work for those who are interested in this. Earlier targeting has been found to be beneficial, and lots of work being done now in terms of route administration, timing, dose, et cetera. So there's going to be a lot more in that arena, obviously with the comment that Dr. Cato made about the aging population here.
Jill,
Linda?
Since you're an expert, though, I'd like to actually ask the two of you on these therapies being combined with recommendations for exercise, because I had a breast cancer and I had a debate with my oncologist about whether I could stay on estrogen HRT, because I had a hysterectomy when I was 40, and the agreement was as long as I exercised a lot. And so what are actually, if you don't mind, if I ask, because it's often people take this
I don't
as
know,
a
it's
binary.
not in the script.
It's not on the script. So I'll ask Deborah.
It's
So
not
I'll
the
just
show,
say,
the run
my
of show.
questions coming from someone. I've been through
Becky?
menopause 6 times because I took these menopause drugs for endometriosis, and none of the menopauses were good. But I think the recommendation, it's always lifestyle things in my view, and I always tell, because I get emails every single day from women with endometriosis asking for advice, and part of it is lifestyle in combination. It's a combination of things. It's your diet, it's your exercise, and it's the hormones. But if you don't have the hormones, you can't exercise because you just don't feel like it. So there are synergies, I think, that we really do need to explore, and that's where AI probably can help a lot, because who's doing what things as they go through these hormone therapies? Because I just think there would be a lot of value in knowing, I got to exercise if I'm taking these drugs, and I feel like it because I'm taking these drugs.
Yeah, we won't turn this into a hormone treatment discussion, although I'm happy to take that offline with anyone who's interested in this. But I'm going to turn it to Colin, though. to ask, how would you use AI to target these kinds of things? Because obviously they're quite complicated, and the data have been collected from deeply phenotyping women and following them longitudinally over the life course, and those data are absolutely critical to incorporate into these larger big data sets, because you can't be scanning thousands and thousands, although there are those who are trying to do that, which is great. But the deeply phenotyping, how would you combine these two to target really important issues over the course of women's lives? And really, when I think about women's lives, I also think, how do we differ from men? We don't exclude men in this conversation. It's really important to bring both men and women into the conversation, because even from a gender point of view, 80% of healthcare utilization is driven by women. That means they bring the males in their lives into treatment. So really important in terms of access and who's going to care. How do you take really complicated issues and incorporate that into your modeling?
So
Minor question.
I'm a big believer in hypothesis-free driven research, right? And maybe that is my background coming from theoretical physics. And I think in the early days of being in the biomedical world and the drug industry, I felt like there maybe was not enough of a focus on hypothesis-free driven approaches, data-driven approaches, and partly because I think there was such a dearth of data and very little theory. I think this is a new day, and so I think there's an opportunity and a necessity to leverage those data sets, those biosamples, and the more advanced mathematics and AI approaches, causal AI approaches, to start to unravel what are the interconnections that are really at play. This is, I think, one thing that's hard for our industry to fathom is what is the size of the space, the dimensionality of the space, meaning how many hypotheses are possible given the number of variables. And it turns out that number grows very, very quickly. And I don't just mean trillions and trillions, I mean numbers like 10 to the 20-something in terms of number of hypotheses. And so we are, I think, now in a new place where data sets that have started to exist, that are longitudinal in nature, that are collecting more and more pieces, including hormones, are going to be the basis of allowing us to discover the surprises. Yeah, I just don't think the hunting and picking approach, the way that science has been done, is going to get us there.
Can I make one comment too?
Yes.
2
minutes. I'm going to be on time.
I'm going to push back on the hypothesis. I mean, I've done unsupervised, never hypothesis-free, because one thing emerging, for example, is past history of infection as a predictor of some chronic inflammatory disease, and the beautiful one is MS and EBV. And there's other ones emerging, and we have a story with chronic Lyme and endometriosis that is like mind-blowing. And so women and men have very different responses to infection, to vaccination, and so on. So are the right data sets there? That's my little, worry about hypothesis-free. Have we measured the right things? You can do things with system serology and so on now to look at past history of exposure to certain infectious, to certain pathogens. And I'll just leave that there so Colin and I can debate later.
And to be clear, the data sets that are used, the patients that they're collected from, the timescales, all have to have some form of hypothesis. So I don't mean fully hypothesis.
All right. We agree then.
We agree.
We agree.
Consensus, which is probably a good place to end then, right? On a consensus note. I just want to thank the panelists who have hopefully been really engaging. Big topic to cover, and I think we covered a number of realms that will really just initiate new conversations, hopefully, which is the point of this. And I just want to thank the organizers and Radcliffe for having us, and I think that's a wrap.
Thank you. I want to join in thanking our panelists, Dr. Linda Griffith, Dr. Colin Hill, and Dr. Deborah Cato, for sharing their invaluable insights, and our moderator, Dr. Jill Goldstein, for shepherding the conversation and the Q&A and giving us a lot to think about. We're going to take a 10-minute break and resume the symposium program promptly at 3:50 p.m. Eastern. Thank you.